The arena roared with the voices of 10,000 aliens, their screams mixing into a sound that shook the metal walls of Orbital Station Nexus 7. And in the center of it all stood a creature that had never known defeat. His name was Vrethkar, and the galaxy called him the Untouched. He stood 7 feet tall with skin that shimmered like liquid metal, and his 4 arms hung at his sides like weapons waiting to be used. His eyes were crystals of deep violet that seemed to look through flesh and bone and into the very soul of anyone who dared to face him. 300 fights he had won, and in all those battles across all those years, not a single opponent had ever landed a blow on his body. His armor skin would harden at the first sign of danger, and his mind could see attacks before they even began. Reading the intent of his enemies like words on a page, he was perfect. Or so everyone believed. On this night he had just finished another victory, standing over the broken body of a Leshan warrior who had been foolish enough to challenge him, and the crowd chanted his name as he raised all 4 fists to the sky, far from the arena. In the lower docking levels, where the air smelled of engine grease and cheap food, Commander Elena Vance sat in a bar and tried to ignore the screens showing the fight. She was 43 years old, with short gray hair and scars on her knuckles that told stories she never shared. Her eyes were the color of Earth's oceans, and right now they were fixed on the glass of whiskey in front of her. "You owe me 200,000 credits," said a voice behind her, and Elena did not need to turn around to know who it was. Syndicate Lord Morath slid into the seat across from her, his reptilian face splitting into a grin that showed rows of needle-sharp teeth. He was a Vexian, a species known for their cruelty and their long memories, and Elena had borrowed money from him 3 years ago to keep her ship flying. "I know what I owe," Elena said, her voice flat and tired. "Then you also know what happens if you do not pay," Morath replied, leaning closer so she could smell the rot on his breath. "Your crew will suffer first, and I will make you watch before I end you." Elena's hand tightened around her glass, but she did not look away from his yellow eyes. "I have a way for you to clear your debt," Morath continued, and something in his voice made her stomach turn cold. "The Crucible is looking for new fighters, and I have arranged for you to face Vrethkar." Elena almost laughed, and it was not a happy sound. "You want me to fight the Untouched," she said, "the alien that nobody has ever hit in 300 matches. I do not expect you to win," Morath said with a wave of his clawed hand. "I only need you to survive 3 rounds. Last that long and your debt is cleared, and if you refuse, then your crew dies tonight." He stood and adjusted his expensive coat, looking down at her with amusement dancing in his eyes. "You have 72 hours to prepare, human. Try not to die too quickly and ruin the entertainment." Then he was gone, leaving Elena alone with her whiskey and the weight of an impossible choice. She could run, but Morath had eyes everywhere, and her crew would pay the price. She could fight and almost certainly die, but at least her people would have a chance. There was really only one answer. The next morning, Elena went to the registration office for the Crucible, a small room staffed by a bored-looking insectoid who barely glanced at her when she entered. "Species?" the clerk asked in a buzzing voice. "Human." The clerk's antennae twitched, and it looked up at her for the first time, compound eyes reflecting her face 100 times over. "You wish to enter the Crucible as a human," it said slowly, as if she might not understand the words. "That is correct. And your opponent, Vrethkar." The clerk made a sound that might have been laughter, a clicking noise that came from deep in its throat. "I will process your entry," it said, "but I want you to know that the odds against you are so high that most gambling houses will not even accept bets. Humans are not known as warriors in this part of the galaxy." Elena signed the forms and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Word spread quickly through the station, and by evening everyone knew that a human woman had volunteered to face the Untouched. Aliens laughed in the corridors and made jokes about how long she would last. Some saying 30 seconds, and others saying she would die before the first bell even finished ringing in. Her small quarters, Elena sat on her bed and thought about everything she knew humans had only been part of. The galactic community for 50 years. And in that time they had gained a reputation as traders and engineers. Clever, but physically weak compared to most species. They were not warriors, not hunters. Just soft creatures from a small blue world who had somehow figured out how to travel between stars. But Elena knew something that the aliens did not. She knew what humans were capable of when they had no other choice. She had served 20 years in the Earth Marines, fighting in conflicts on 3 different worlds. And she had seen things that would break the minds of these comfortable station dwellers. She had held friends as they died, and she had killed enemies with her bare hands when her weapons failed. The aliens saw her species as weak, because humans did not have armor skin or forearms or precognitive abilities. But they did not understand that weakness had made humanity strong. Every human who had ever lived had to fight for survival against a world that wanted to kill them. And that struggle had forged something in their bones that no amount of genetic engineering could replicate. Lana pulled up recordings of Rethkar's fights and began to watch, her eyes tracking every movement, every reaction, every tiny detail that might give her an edge somewhere. In all that perfection, there had to be a flaw, and she had 72 hours to find it. Elena watched the recordings for 16 hours straight, her eyes burning and her back aching from sitting in the same position. But she did not stop, because stopping meant dying. She watched Rethkar destroy a massive Grand warrior with a single spinning kick to the skull. She watched him dodge a Teshan's poison claws like he knew exactly where they would strike. She watched him break the arms of a 4-armed Kurvani warrior who had trained his whole life for that moment. Every fight was the same. And every fight ended the same way. His opponents would attack, and he would already be moving, his body shifting to avoid blows that had not yet been thrown, his armor skin hardening in the exact spots where strikes would land. It was like he could see the future, like he was fighting people who moved in slow motion while he moved at normal speed. How does he do it? Elena muttered to herself, rewinding another recording for the 5th time. Then she saw Ida Valaxian. Fighter had thrown a punch at Rethkar's head, but at the last moment had changed the direction of the strike toward his ribs. For just a fraction of a second, Rethkar had moved the wrong way, his armor hardening on his face instead of his side, and only his incredible reflexes had allowed him to recover in time. He was not seeing the future, he was reading intent. Elena leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath as the pieces fell into place in her mind. Rethkar's species had evolved on a world full of predators, and they had developed the ability to sense the neural patterns of other creatures, to feel the electrical signals that fired in a brain before a muscle even twitched. When someone decided to throw a punch, Rethkar knew about it before their arms started moving. It was an incredible advantage, maybe the greatest natural weapon in the galaxy. But it had one weakness: you had to decide to attack before he could read you. And if you did not decide, then there was nothing for him to see. Elena closed her eyes and remembered her old combat instructor, a wrinkled man named Tanaka, who had taught hand-to-hand combat at the Marine training facility on Luna. The fastest punch is not the one you throw with your muscles, he had told her once. It is the one you throw without thinking, when your body moves and your mind is empty. We call this mushin, the state of no mind. She had practiced that technique for years, learning to let her training take over while her conscious thoughts went silent. It was not easy, and it took thousands of hours of drilling the same movements until they became as natural as breathing. Elena stood up and moved to the center of her small room, pushing the furniture against the walls to make space. Then she began to train. She started with basic combinations, throwing punches and kicks at an imaginary opponent while focusing on clearing her mind. At first it was difficult because fear kept creeping in, fear of the fight and fear of death. But slowly she found the stillness she was looking for. Her body moved, and her mind was empty. Hours passed, and she kept training. Her muscles burning and her lungs aching for air, but she did not stop. She could not afford to stop. Meanwhile, in another part of the station, Vrethkar sat in his private quarters and did something he had never done before. He was watching recordings of humans, not human fighters, because there were very few of those in the Galactic Arena circuit, but recordings of human history and human warfare. He had become curious about his upcoming opponent, curious about this species that was considered so weak by everyone in the galaxy. What he saw disturbed him. He watched humans charge into battle against enemies that outnumbered them 10-1, screaming war cries and laughing even as they died. He watched them survive wounds that would kill any other species, fighting on with broken bones and missing limbs like they did not even notice the pain. He watched a recording from Earth's ancient history, something called the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 human warriors had held back an army of thousands for 3 days. They are insane, Vrethkar said quietly to himself. His manager, a thin Vexian named Krell, looked up from his datapad with a confused expression. Who is insane? Champion. The humans, Vrethkar replied, his violet eyes still fixed on the screen. They do not fight like other species. There is no logic to them, no self-preservation. They simply attack and keep attacking until they win or they die. Krell made a dismissive sound and returned to his work. Your opponent is a middle-aged female with no augmentations and no combat record in the arena. She is not a threat to you, champion, and the fight will be over in seconds. But Vrethkar was not so sure he could read the intent of any creature in the galaxy, sense their thoughts, and predict their movements. But when he looked at recordings of humans in combat, he saw something that made him uneasy. He saw chaos. Their movements were wild and unpredictable, driven by emotion rather than logic, and their eyes held a light that he did not understand. They were not afraid to die, and some of them seemed to welcome it if it meant taking their enemies with them. For the first time in his long career, Vrethkar felt something that he could not name. A cold sensation in his chest that he had never experienced before was not fear. He told himself it could not be fear because he had never been afraid of anything. But when he tried to sense the neural patterns in the recording of his opponent, when he tried to feel the electrical impulses that would tell him her intentions, he found something strange. He found stillness. The human woman in the recording was training alone in her quarters, throwing punches and kicks at nothing, and her mind was completely empty. There were no thoughts to read, no intentions to predict, just the movement of muscle and bone without any signal. To warn him of what was coming, Vrethkar turned off the screen and sat in the darkness for a long time. The fight was in 48 hours for the first time in 300 matches. The Untouched did not know what to expect. The Crucible was the largest arena on orbital station Nexus 7, a massive dome of reinforced steel and energy shields that could hold 50,000 spectators. And on this night, every seat was filled. Aliens of 100 different species had come to watch the show. Not because they expected a good fight, but because they wanted to see something funny. A human fighting the Untouched was the greatest joke the station had heard in years. And everyone wanted to be there when the punchline was delivered. Food vendors walked through the crowds, selling snacks and drinks. And betting stations flashed odds that were so one-sided they were almost embarrassing. Some stations had stopped taking bets on Elena entirely because there was no point. And the only question anyone was asking was how many seconds she would last in the fighter's entrance. Tunnel Elena stood alone and listened to the roar of the crowd. Her hands were wrapped in fighting tape, and her body was covered in a simple gray combat suit. She had no armor and no weapons. Just her fists and her training and the cold stillness in her Mindegard approached her. A massive Gron with tusks as long as her forearm. Human, he grunted. You can still withdraw. No one will think less of you for running. Elena looked up at him and smiled. And there was something in that smile that made the guard take a step back. I am not running, she said quietly. The tunnel doors opened and light flooded in. Blinding and hot, and the sound of the crowd hit her like a physical wave. She walked forward into the arena with her head held high, and 50,000 aliens laughed and jeered and threw food at her. She did not react. She kept walking until she reached the center of the fighting ring, a circle of hard metal surrounded by energy barriers that would keep the fight contained. And she stood there with her arms at her sides while the crowd screamed insults in a dozen different languages. Then the opposite tunnel opened, and the laughter stopped. Vrethkar emerged like a god of war, his silver skin catching the light and sending reflections dancing across the walls. His forearms were raised in triumph, and his violet eyes scanned the crowd with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. The spectators chanted his name so loud that the floor shook, and he smiled at them with rows of perfect white teeth before. Turning his attention to his opponent, he looked at Elena, and his smile faded just a little. She was not afraid. He could sense the emotions of every creature in the arena, the excitement and the bloodlust and the cruel anticipation. But from the human woman, he sensed nothing at all. She stood before him like a statue, her eyes empty and her mind a blank wall that he could not read. Human, he said, his voice deep and resonant. I will try to make this quick. Elena did not respond. The referee, a floating drone covered in cameras and sensors, moved to the center of the ring and announced the rules in a mechanical voice. 3 rounds of 5 minutes each, no weapons allowed, and the fight would end when one fighter was unconscious or yielded. Fighters, ready. The drone asked. Vrethkar raised his 4 fists and dropped into a fighting stance that looked like flowing water. Elena raised her hands and said nothing. Begin. The signal sounded, and Vrethkar reached out with his mind to read his opponent's intentions, to see her first attack before she could even throw it. And he found nothing. His mind touched hers and felt only stillness, like trying to grab smoke with his bare hands. And for a fraction of a second, he was confused. That fraction of a second was all Elena needed. She moved her first strike was a palm heel to his throat, driven upward with all the force her body could generate, and it landed before his armor skin could harden. The impact crushed his windpipe for just a moment, and he staggered back with a sound of shock that echoed through the suddenly silent arena. But Elena was not finished. Her second strike was a hook to his floating ribs, driven by her hips and her legs and the momentum of her spinning body. It landed with a crack that everyone in the front rows could hear, and purple blood sprayed from his mouth. Third strike, an elbow to his temple that rattled his brain inside his skull. Fourth strike, a knee to his inner thigh that dead his leg and made him stumble. Fifth strike, a uppercut that caught him under the chin and sent his head snapping back so hard that his neck popped. All of this happened in less than 3 seconds. Vrethkar fell backward and caught himself with his lower arms, his violet eyes wide with shock and his silver skin covered in his own purple blood. He stared at the human woman who had not moved from her stance, her hand still raised and her eyes still empty. The arena was completely silent. 50,000 aliens sat frozen in their seats, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The untouched had been touched, had been hit not once but 5 times in the span of a heartbeat. And he was bleeding. Then someone in the crowd made a sound, a gasp of disbelief. And suddenly everyone was screaming, not laughing anymore, screaming. The betting stations went crazy as odds shifted wildly in all directions, and the camera zoomed in on Elena's face, looking for some sign of triumph or satisfaction. They found nothing, but calm. Vrethkar pushed himself to his feet, and wiped the blood from his mouth with one of his upper hands. His eyes had changed, the amusement and confidence replaced by something darker and more dangerous. "How?" he demanded. His voice, rough from the damage to his throat. Lena did not answer. She simply raised her fists and waited the untouched, looked at this human woman. This creature from a weak species on a small world. And he understood something that changed everything. She was not fighting him. She was flowing. Her body moved without her mind giving orders, acting and reacting on pure instinct and muscle memory. And there was no intention for him to read, because she was not thinking at all. She had become something that his abilities could not predict. A warrior of pure action without decision for the first time in 300 fights. Vrethkar felt the cold touch of fear, and the round was only beginning. Vrethkar had lived for over 200 years, and all that time he had never felt what he was feeling now. His throat burned where she had struck him, and his ribs ached with every breath. And the taste of his own blood was strange and bitter on his tongue. He was hurt. The realization hit him harder than her fists had. Harder than anything had ever hit him in his entire life. Because being hurt meant that he was not invincible. And if he was not invincible, then he could lose. But Vrethkar had not become the greatest fighter in the galaxy by giving up when things got difficult. He dropped lower into his stance and expanded his awareness, pushing his precognitive abilities further than he ever had before. If he could not read her intentions, then he would read her body, watching for the tiny movements of muscle and tendon. That came before every strike. Elena moved again, and this time he was ready. He caught her punch with his lower left arm and drove his upper right fist into her stomach so hard that she lifted off the ground. The air exploded from her lungs, and she flew backward, crashing into the energy barrier with a sound like breaking glass. The crowd roared with approval. Ritter did not give her time to recover. He rushed forward with all four arms swinging, raining blows down on her like a storm of violence. And each impact sent shockwaves through the arena floor. Lena blocked what she could, but he was too fast and too strong. A punch slipped through her guard and cracked two of her ribs, and another caught her in the shoulder and dislocated the joint with a wet popping sound. She fell to one knee and coughed blood onto the metal floor. "Stay down," Vrethkar said, his voice echoing through the arena. "You have proven your courage, human. But this fight is over." Elena looked up at him through swollen eyes and did something that made the entire crowd go silent again. She smiled, not a smile of defeat or desperation, but a smile of pure joy, like a child playing her favorite game. And she pushed herself back to her feet with her broken ribs grinding against each other and her dislocated shoulder hanging uselessly at her side. "Over?" she asked, her voice rough but steady. "We are just getting started." The aliens in the crowd exchanged confused glances because they did not understand. Any other species would have stayed down after taking that kind of damage, would have yielded or fallen unconscious. But this human was standing up and asking for more. Vrethkar attacked again, and Elena met him head-on. She could not block his punches with her injured arm, so she stopped trying. Instead, she let them land, taking brutal hits to her body and face while she searched for openings in his defense. A punch cracked her orbital bone, and she jabbed 2 fingers into his eye. A kick broke her ankle, and she drove her knee into his groin. Every time he hurt her, she hurt him back, trading damage like currency, paying in pain for the chance to make him bleed. The fight became something that no one in the arena had ever seen before. Not a battle of skill or speed, but a war of attrition. 2 warriors destroying each other piece by piece, while the crowd watched in horrified fascination. "Why won't you fall?" Vrethkar demanded, his voice breaking with exhaustion and confusion. "Your bones are broken and your blood is everywhere. Why you keep fighting?" Elena spat a tooth onto the floor and raised her one working fist. "Because humans are not designed to give up," she said. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day. A world of predators and disease and natural disasters. And we survived all of it because we are too stubborn to die. She attacked again. Slower now, but still relentless. And Vrethkar realized with growing horror that she was right. Humans were not like other species. They did not have armor skin or precognitive abilities or forearms. They were soft and fragile and easy to break, but they had something else. Something that 300 years of evolution on a peaceful world had bred out of his own species. They had endurance. The recordings he had watched came back to him now. Images of humans running across deserts for days without stopping. Of soldiers fighting through wounds that should have killed them. Of ordinary people lifting impossible weights to save their loved ones. Humans were persistence hunters, creatures who chased their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. And they had carried that instinct with them into the stars. Vrethkar was stronger and faster and better trained. But Elena did not need to be any of those things. She just needed to keep going. The bell sounded for the end of the first round, and both fighters retreated to their corners. Medical drones swarmed around them, injecting painkillers and sealing wounds. But the damage was already done. Elena sat on her stool with blood dripping down her face and a strange light burning in her eyes. Her corner team, a group of humans from her ship who had refused to let her fight alone, worked frantically to tape her broken ribs and reduce the swelling around her eyes. "You can yield," her first mate said. A young man named Chun, who looked like he was about to cry. "You have already done the impossible. You have already proven that humans can fight." Elena shook her head. "I did not come here to prove anything," she said quietly. "I came here to win." Across the ring, Vrethkar stared at her with eyes that held no more arrogance. No more amusement, only a deep and terrible respect. He had faced 300 opponents and defeated them all. But none of them had ever looked at him the way this human was looking at him now, like he was the prey, like she was the hunter. And, for the first time in his immortal life, the Untouched wondered if he was going to survive this fight. The bell rang for the second round, and both fighters rose from their corners like broken machines trying to complete one final task. Elena could barely see. Through her swollen eyes, and every breath sent lightning bolts of pain through her cracked ribs. Her left arm hung useless at her side, and her right ankle could not support her weight. But she limped forward anyway, because stopping was not something she knew how to do. Vrethkar was in better shape, but not by much. His silver skin was covered in purple bruises, and one of his forearms was bent at an angle that suggested serious damage. And the confidence that had carried him through 300 victories was nowhere to be found. They met in the center of the ring and began to trade blows. Again had abandoned any pretense of defense, taking punches to her body and face while she searched for chances to hurt him back. She was fighting on instinct now, her conscious mind retreating to a quiet place while her training took over. Vrethkar hit her with an uppercut that should have ended the fight, and she stayed on her feet. He hit her with a spinning kick that would have killed most species, and she caught his leg and drove her elbow into his knee. He grabbed her with all four arms and squeezed until her ribs cracked louder than before, and she headbutted him in the face hard enough to break his nose. The crowd had stopped cheering. 50,000 aliens watched in complete silence, their entertainment forgotten and replaced by something they did not have words for. This was not a fight anymore. This was a testament to something they had never seen before. A display of will and determination that defied everything they thought they knew about the weak species from Earth. Elena fell and got back up. She fell again and got back up again. Every time Vrethkar knocked her down, she would push herself off the bloody floor and raise her fists. Her swollen face twisted into that same impossible smile. And every time he felt something inside himself crack a little more, he had spent his entire life being told that he was perfect, that his species was the pinnacle of evolution, that his gifts made him better than everyone else in the galaxy. He had believed it because he had never had any reason to doubt. Never met anyone who could challenge that belief, but this human woman was destroying everything he thought he knew. She was broken and bleeding and barely conscious. But she was still fighting, still standing, still refusing to accept that she was supposed to lose. She was not better than him in any way that could be measured, not faster or stronger or smarter. But she had something that he did not have. The word came to him from the human recordings he had watched. A concept that did not translate well into his language, but that he understood now in a way that went beyond words. It meant courage and determination and the refusal to give up. The fire that burned inside someone who had decided that death was better than surrender. Vrether had never had to develop that fire because he had never needed it. Everything had always been easy for him. The bell sounded for the end of the second round, and Elena collapsed onto her stool, while her corner team scrambled to keep her alive. They were crying now, all of them, because they knew she was dying, and they could not make her stop. One more round, Elena whispered through bloody lips. Just one more. Rethkar sat in his own corner and stared at the floor, his thoughts racing faster than they ever had before. He could finish her in the third round, could put her down for good, and add another victory to his record. But something inside him rebelled at the thought. This was not right. He had won 300 fights and felt nothing but satisfaction. But if he won this fight, he knew he would feel nothing but shame. Defeating this human would not prove that he was the greatest warrior in the galaxy. It would only prove that his gifts had allowed him to beat someone who was already half dead. She had earned something that none of his other opponents had ever earned. She had earned his respect. The bell rang for the third round and both fighters moved to the center of the ring. But before Elena could raise her fists, Rethkar did something that made the entire arena gasp in shock. Raised his upper right arm with his fist clenched and spoke words in the ancient Korvani tongue. Words that had not been spoken in the arena for over a century. I yield. The crowd exploded into chaos. Aliens screamed and threw things and demanded refunds, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The untouched had yielded, had surrendered to a human woman who could barely stand, had given up a fight that he could still have won. But Rethkar did not care about the crowd. He walked forward until he stood before Elena and looked down at her with eyes full of something that might have been tears. "I've never been hit," he said, his voice carrying through the arena despite the noise. "In 300 fights, no one has ever touched me, and I believe that made me great. I believe that my gifts made me better than everyone else, that I was the perfect warrior." He dropped to one knee so that he was at her level. "You have shown me the truth," he continued. "I was never great. I was simply never challenged. I was never tested because my abilities made testing unnecessary. And so I never learned what it truly means to fight." He reached out with his uninjured arm and took her hand. "You are broken and bleeding, and you should have fallen a dozen times, but you did not. You kept fighting because that is what humans do, because that is who you are, and that courage is worth more than all my gifts combined." He bowed his head. "To fight you further would dishonor us both. You have already won. Human, you won the moment you stood up the first time. And every moment after that was simply proof of your victory." Elena stood there swaying on her broken ankle, blood dripping from her face and her body screaming in agony. But in that moment, she felt no pain. She felt only the weight of what had just happened. The knowledge that she had done what everyone said was impossible. She had touched the untouched. The arena fell silent as the referee drone announced her victory. And then a single voice in the crowd began to cheer. It was Chun, her first mate, standing on his seat and screaming her name. And slowly other voices joined him, humans at first, the small scattered population of her species on the station, but then others joined in. Aliens who had come to laugh at her now screamed her name like a prayer, like a battle cry. Like the first note of a song that would spread across the galaxy, Commander Elena Vance had done the impossible, and the galaxy would never look at humans the same way again.